The Houston Texans are 0-3, and they have no hope. None whatsoever. Yes, the defense is awesome. I love the way that they fly around. The secondary's good. The pass rush is there. The linebackers are awesome. They have dudes at all three levels of their defense. The issue is the offense. It is legitimately amongst the worst in the NFL. And it also starts up front. This offensive line is so bad. It was bad last year. C.J. Stroud sacked the second most in the NFL, only behind Caleb Williams. Okay, so they go out, they get rid of everybody, and they brought in five new guys, and new isn't always better. In this situation, it is legitimately worse. Like they might have the worst offensive line in the NFL. That's how bad it is. Okay, their leading rusher, Nick Chubb, barely has 100 rushing yards through 3 games. And I get it, they're splitting carries and all those things, but through 3 games, your leading rusher only has 100 rushing yards. Like, that is problematic. Okay? And the difference between last year and this year, to me, is the skill guys, right? Joe Mixon was a 1,000-yard rusher last year behind a bad offensive line, and it doesn't look like the Texans are going to have a 1,000-yard rusher this year. And then in terms of throwing the football, the weapons were so much better. So yes, the offensive line for the Texans was bad last year, but they just had guys who got open quickly. Nico Collins, Tank Dell, who's out for the year, John Mechie, who got traded to the Eagles, Stephon Diggs before the injury, those 8 games he played in, he looks really good. Robert Woods, a little bit older, but still a guy who was able to get open. When you look at the Texans this year, the only receiver that they have who can legitimately get open is Nico Collins. Much easier to defend him when he's the only real threat on the outside. Obviously, they still have Dalton Schultz, but he's just a little bit older. Dalton Schultz is actually the Texans' second leading receiver with 96 receiving yards on the year. For reference, Nico Collins had 104 receiving yards against the Jaguars on Sunday alone. So maybe Christian Kirk, who finally got to play in that game against Jacksonville, maybe his showing up can give their offense a little bit of a boost. But there's just not a ton of hope there. Okay, I just don't think that they have enough guys around Stroud to be able to overcome just such a terrible offensive line. Okay, so there is a path for them to win games. And it's ball control, which is really tough to do with that offensive line because it's just going to be tough to run the football. But it's ball control, winning games like 17-13, leaning on your defense, right? That is how the Houston Texans are going to be able to find ways to win this year. And then on 3rd and 8, because you're going to find yourself in that situation with this Texans offensive line, you can ask C.J. Stroud to make 3 or 4 plays a game for you. But they should be a run-heavy, ball control offense. Let the defense rest up whenever the offense has the football, and then allow them to go win the game for you. Because that defense, like I said, it's just nasty. I mean, so many good players on the defense, and it feels like such a waste of a season for the Texans because the defense is really good. And C.J. Stroud, I know he's going to come under so much scrutiny. But look, the supporting cast is terrible, and we're seeing how important that is in Indianapolis with Daniel Jones. And he spends time in New York behind a bad offensive line with one legitimately good wide receiver, and things were terrible. Now he's in Indianapolis behind a good offensive line with just a plethora of weapons, and he looks awesome. So for Stroud, they've got to find a way to get weapons around him and to improve that offensive line. Because that offensive line, it is terrible. And it's going to cost them a spot in the playoffs. Over 0-2 in a world where 14 teams make the playoffs and you have 17 games in a season, you can overcome an 0-2 start. 0-3 is much tougher. Texans have to go 10-4 down the stretch, and they've got a really tough a really tough stretch of games coming up. I say 10-4 because usually 10 wins gets you into the playoffs. I know that didn't work for Seattle last year, but usually that works. So the Texans play the Titans next week. They should win that game. So they should be 1-3. Then they're going to play at the Ravens. It's probably a loss. And then they have their bye week. Great. Like, you don't lose the game that week. That's congratulations, Houston. And then they're at the Seahawks. That's probably a loss. Seahawks look really good. Then they get the 49ers, a team that's 3-0 and just super scrappy. And then they get the Broncos at home. So they could be 1-7, 8 games into the season. That is not out of the question for the Houston Texans. It's going to be a long year for them unless they can somehow, some way figure out how to block, because the offensive line is just bad. And it's really tough to win football games in the NFL when you can't run the football and when you can't give your quarterback time, even if they're a really good player like C.J. Stroud is.